Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up for the Read-Eh-Thon, which is the Canadian-themed read-a-thon that was created by Books and Lala. I saw a bunch of announcements for this on the channel Onyx Pages. There were a bunch of other hosts. I will link to everybody below. I read 2 Canadian books that week. It was a couple of weeks ago now. And they were both dystopias, and it's funny because I expected that one of them I was going to really enjoy, and one of them would probably just be okay, and that was true, but it was the opposite book. The book I thought I was going to love, I didn't really love. The book that I was just reading so that I could have conversations about it, I actually enjoyed, so that was funny. So the first of these 2 books was Cherie Dimaline's The Merrell Thieves. This was on the Canada Reads list a couple of years ago. It might have been last year. I think it was 2 years ago though. In any case, I think a lot of people were reading it for this read-a-thon. And it is set in a future in which non-Indigenous Canadians, who knows about the rest of the world, have stopped dreaming. There's also been some kind of climate change, so there's flooding in some places. But what's really interesting about this is that the characters in the story itself don't actually have all the details. So there are a lot of things, even the Marrow element that the title comes from is eventually shown to not actually be what's happening. There's actually more of a mystical element going on, and I really liked that because I think there's a tendency in books that are written for younger audiences, and this is written for a young adult audience, to want to make things needlessly straightforward, and I really appreciated that this didn't do that. And not to spoil anything, but I think the other thing that this did that I think a lot of books for a younger audience don't do is to allow for an ending that doesn't have a pure resolution. This does end on a somewhat more uplifting note because quite a bit of this book is quite grim, but despite the fact that it's uplifting, it's a hopeful note as opposed to a note of resolution. So I was really impressed that it managed to end this way. Which is not to say that I thought this was perfect. There is a romance between the main character, who is a teenage boy, and this girl who is in his group that was quite cringeworthy in a way that a lot of kind of forced teenage romances in this kind of story are. But ultimately that is a pretty minor complaint, and what I thought overall was a book that had a lot more respect for a younger audience than a lot of these books do. If you're not familiar with this book, this follows a group of Indigenous, mostly kids with a couple of elders, who are heading north because north is where they're feeling that safety is. And we follow them along the way as they meet different people and have different encounters. And it is primarily this journey, but it's also a journey in which people share information at different points. So we learn both character tidbits and world tidbits as we go, which I thought played out really well. And I thought the world made sense in a way that you can imagine how the pre-existing both general prejudices and structural racism that Indigenous people face in Canada could lead down the kind of path that this presents if you look at other countries over the past 20 or 30 years where there have been sudden ethnic cleansing events where everybody says, how did that happen? And then there's some clear historical precedent for what had happened. And you can see that path, which I think was quite successful, because often I'll read a dystopia and think, I don't feel like society would go that way. That doesn't necessarily make sense, but I thought this made sense insofar as a book with mystical elements can make sense. That was impressive. Depressing, maybe? Because I think if you have a more positive attitude towards humanity, you might disagree with me on that, but yeah, I thought that was quite well handled. And I just loved the way the misunderstandings were held. The fact that the very idea that this book is titled for, about the Marrow, turns out to not be correct, or turns out to be based on a misunderstanding, I thought was really well handled. I thought maybe that could have been a slightly more explicit, because there is only one line that points that out near the end. I did again think that shows a lot more respect for the audience than a lot of books for a younger audience would. And not just in terms of the major things. There's one where the main character meets a couple of Guyanese women, and it leads to him musing on things that happened in the islands. And I think Guyana is obviously in South America, but because there's the cultural connection to the Caribbean, a lot of people do think it's one of the islands. So I thought it was kind of fun that the main character apparently had this same misunderstanding that people have in real life, and the book allowed him to have that. So I thought there was a lot of stuff like that that lent a kind of, again, respect for the audience that I wasn't expecting at all, because I'm very cynical about how books for teenagers are written. I was also surprised by how relentlessly grim it did get in the middle. A lot of the characters talk about their backstories, and a lot of the things that they suffered aren't necessarily described explicitly in the sense of providing a lot of gory details, but they are explicit in that there's a lot of clear rape and abuse and whatnot. So I do think there's a little bit more of that than you expect in a book for teenagers. as well. But in any case, I was impressed by that because I think most teenagers can handle stronger content than a lot of books aimed at the young adult market do put in. And then I followed that up by reading another Canadian dystopia, and this time one that I was very much eagerly anticipating, and that was Catherine Hernandez's Crosshairs, which comes out, I believe, in just over a month. I picked this up as an ARC through NetGalley. I was very enthusiastic to pick this up because I'd really enjoyed Hernandez's Scarborough, which came out a couple of years ago. She did a panel at the Festival of Literary Diversity where she was moderating a panel on science fiction writing, and I really enjoyed some of the things she said on that, even just as a moderator, so I was curious to see what her take on science fiction would be. And I ended up not really loving this as much as I had hoped I would. So Crosshairs creates a near-future dystopian Toronto in which we have this heavily US-allied both city, provincial, and national government. If you assume that the US government continues on its right-wing populist trend that it's on right now, imagine that government being allies with a cross between the worst of the Bloc and the worst of the Tories here in Canada, is I guess the government that they're imagining. And basically they've built this military apartheid state, which makes for a really interesting idea. There's a lot of things of work camps and people probably being executed somewhere. And the best bits of it are really brilliant. There is a wonderful, there's a scene, for example, of the main character, Kay, and he's learning how to shoot firearms, but we're also getting a flashback to his youth when he's learning about drag queen performance. And the two things are interwoven in a way that's just perfect. And that sequence was just brilliant. I think the book is almost worth reading just for that sequence. And also one thing that I enjoyed is a lot of the flashbacks have some very Toronto references. They talk about things like the Buddies in Bad Times theater group and the Glad Day bookstore and various intersections that are real places. And that's a lot of fun. But the problem with that is that it grounds it in a kind of realistic version of the current day. And as we go through with the story, things become more and more theatrical and more over the top. And the two tones don't really go together, or at least didn't work together for me. I think Hernandez's background is in theater, and I think if you are a theater scene person, a lot of that will probably work better for you than it did for me. But for me, I found a lot of it almost ridiculous. There's one section where there's a character, Beck, who is this white ex-military guy, and the other characters like to make a point to him that, you know, just because you're gay doesn't mean you're oppressed, because you can turn it off and you're still this white guy, which is a fair point about how levels of privilege and prejudice work and would work in this military dictatorship type setting. But it's discussed in a way that reminded me of the really over-the-top parodies that you see of HR sensitivity seminars on sitcoms. It was that level of dialogue. And if you're reading it with a kind of theatrical ear, maybe that works. But because so much of the rest of it was set up realistically, I was reading it and thinking it was so over the top. And this whole book had this issue in that it would have very realistic segments and then these very over-the-top theatrical segments, and the theatrical stuff just didn't work for me. That is clearly a matter of taste. If you like theatrical dialogues, those elements will not bother you the way they bothered me, but it is what it is, right?
This is editing me with some thoughts from the future. As I was editing this, I did go back and look at the introduction in this book, which I'm not going to read from because the eGalley actually does say don't quote from the book, because things may change from the advanced copy to the final copy that's coming out next month. Which means that I had to edit out a little bit of something here. So I'm going to jump back into talking about some character pieces, but unfortunately that means this is going to sound a little more negative than it originally would have before I took out the part where I quoted things. So just imagine that I'm saying slightly more positive things about the main characters in here.
I am going to mention a couple of sort of minor spoilers that bothered me. One of the things that this world sets up is that the first people that they killed off were the elderly and disabled people. And throughout the book we have various brief moments of disability elements, almost all of which seem to be very symbolic and not actual character pieces. We meet one disabled character who actually gets a voice, and we get to meet in this, and she commits, spoiler, but she commits suicide. And if you have the disabled person commit suicide, in a book where you're being so intentional about other elements of identity, which this is, but in a book that is clearly trying to make a point about demographics, to fall into stereotype like that is just jarring, considering the overall messaging about everything else in this. So that was very odd to me. The second thing that was very odd to me is there is one point where, so this paramilitary organization, the Boots, which is presented as being all white people. At one point we have one of the sort of secondary main characters, who's Persian, who is being sent to this work camp. And she meets one of the Boots, and she recognizes them as also being of Iranian heritage, they say. And it was weird to me that, one, she didn't recognize her as also being Persian, because saying you're also Iranian, like, I don't know, this person could be Kurdish or Armenian or Azer. You can be any of those things and still be Iranian, right? And it also presented the Boot character, the military one, as being in costume, as opposed to legitimately considering herself a white person, which a lot of people do. And on the one hand, I appreciate it that at least there's this awareness that there isn't some strict racial line, but the way it was presented as costuming, and also the way it drew attention to nationality over ethnicity, felt like it was going halfway. And I thought, again, this is a book that is so careful about, like, with the main character is half Filipino and half black, and the balances of his upbringing with his single mother who is Filipina, and the way people react to him based on his appearance, where he's generally kind of black-coated. That's such a huge point about this. In addition to that, we have 2 Persian characters and 2 Anglo-white characters that we follow. And there's so much care given to those elements that having this extra thing that went, we're going to talk nationality rather than ethnicity, is super odd. That feels like maybe more complaining than it should be, because overall I still thought this was an engaging read. I read it fairly quickly. The flow was great. I think I went in expecting that I was going to love this based on what I've read from the author before, and it just, for the most part, the theatricality just was not for me. And I think being so intentional about the identity elements does draw attention to the places where it feels somewhat less intentional. And I think it's hard to make that work if you're very careful in one way and not careful in another way. It kind of draws attention to that, which I think in any other book I would notice, but I wouldn't care as much, because they're clearly not putting any effort into that. And in this, she's clearly putting effort into that. In any case, I think it's excellent to see more Canadian fiction that's trying to dig into this kind of mixture of social commentary and speculative fiction. And when this was good, I thought it was excellent. Like, the firearms drag queen mixture was just great. Like, I cannot say enough about how well that worked. When this was good, it was brilliant. And if you're a theater person, you will like this more than I did. So, there we go. So those were the 2 Canadian dystopias that I read during the Read-Eh-Thon. If you've read the Merrell Thieves, or if you are one of the people who's picked up the arc of Crosshairs as well, I'd love to hear what you thought. I regret now that I didn't read volumes 2 and 3 of Ab Irato, which is also a Canadian dystopia, with a Montreal setting instead of an Ontario setting, which both of these had. So anyway, I didn't. Next time. If you have a favorite Canadian dystopia, I'd love to hear what it is, because it would be fun to read more, because I feel like I haven't seen that many other than that and these 2. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.